I was interested to learn just now that clapping is the traditional Putney way of starting a meeting. And I think that's really an excellent idea. Because it spares the inconvenience in case there's no clapping at the end of the meeting. I thought I would spend my time discussing the problem of nuclear proliferation in the Near East and South Asia. And I start there because it really, in many ways, it is the central issue, certainly a central regional issue, but I would argue possibly the central impediment to getting to zero nuclear weapons. But perhaps a preliminary word to note that in many ways, Mr. note just how successful the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has been. For example, in the 70s, one worried enormously that Brazil and Argentina would be engaged in an arms race. At that time, neither of them were signatories to the treaty. They were both under military dictatorships. They were rivals. They were escalating their military spending. And then came the democratic governments in both countries, helped in Argentina by the utterly misguided invasion of the Falkland Islands. And both countries signed up to the NPT and dismantled their nuclear programs, contributing to the fact that South America is, along with North America, the most peaceful region in the world. South Africa turned out to have covertly acquired nuclear weapons. It dismantled them at the time of the transition from the apartheid regime to the democratic regime. And there are other cases. Sweden, actually, in the 1950s, tested a small nuclear device, or nuclear-like device. And then in the 90s, we had the breakup of the Soviet Union, which produced 4 new nuclear states, 3 of which agreed to give up their nuclear weapons. That is Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And so when we look at this, at the area of concern, it is a finite area of concern. First, there's of course the issue of North Korea, which is the only country, so far as I know, to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and to then go on and detonate, perhaps not entirely successfully, a couple of nuclear weapons. But frankly, North Korea is kind of a gnat in the problem. And it's one of those problems that is clearly solvable by waiting it out. It's a regime that does not have a long future. Its nuclear weapons, it's very limited what it can do, a very limited amount of fissile material, and it has not provoked a response, a decision by the regional neighbors, South Korea and Japan, to acquire nuclear weapons. So it hasn't had any follow-on effect. I would also argue that that the North Korean nuclear program is a legacy of one of the numerous legacies of the utterly incompetent and weak foreign policy of the Bush administration, which substituted tough talk for actually doing anything constructive. It is likely that North Korea was cheating on its previous agreement by having a clandestine enrichment facility, but if it was cheating slowly. And instead, the Bush administration broke the Clinton-era deal, and as a result, North Korea then went to its supply of plutonium and developed the nuclear weapons. We made all sorts of tough statements how that was unacceptable, but then did nothing about it. And to me, that's the worst of all possible situations. But anyhow, that is a separate problem that does not threaten the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The area that does is South Asia and the Middle East. South Asia, there's a very specific history of proliferation. It began, it's somewhat debatable as to what were the causative factors. Pakistan decided on a nuclear weapons program after the 1971 war, in which India had prevailed over Pakistan and dismantled the country, producing the independent country of Bangladesh. At least that's how the Pakistanis saw it. I think the sole responsibility for that war really rests with the military regime and the brutal repression of East Bengal. And so Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who became president after that war, famously said that Pakistan would eat grass in order to have a nuclear weapon to offset India. And at the same time, India, which had a nuclear program, I'm afraid it was an offshoot of a civilian nuclear program under an agreement that my father, as President Kennedy's ambassador to India, had negotiated, Tarapur Agreement, went forward. I think the first case where a weapon was made from a civilian reactor and detonated not what it called a peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. And that certainly also spurred the Pakistani nuclear arms race. I could discuss, and maybe in the Q&A will, if people have questions, the efforts that the U.S. took, significantly driven by the Congress, and I guess I will claim some credit for the most important of these provisions, the so-called Pressler Amendment, which actually had not a great deal to do with Senator Pressler, which linked U.S. arms sales and assistance to Pakistan, keeping its promise not to develop nuclear weapons. And whether those kinds of linkages and sanctions actually were effective, and that's a debatable proposition. But by 1990, Pakistan had crossed the threshold to acquire nuclear material, and of course in 1998, both India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons. Now, the reason that this is, and these are both countries that are probably most engaged in the development of new nuclear arms. So there really is a nuclear arms race there. So at the time that the rest of the world is either freezing or reducing, you have a nuclear arms race there. The dynamic of it, certainly India's motivation in becoming a nuclear power, I think, was significantly prestige. It resented the idea that China was treated as one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, felt it was because China had nuclear weapons that India, which soon will be the world's most populous country, ought to be treated the same way. And to some degree, although India's nuclear tests produced sanctions initially, it has now been accepted, and although it's not formally recognized as a nuclear power on the NPT, it is really accepted as a full nuclear power, and that's evidenced by the U.S.-India nuclear agreement. Pakistan, although, is not accepted. That is for a number of reasons, one of which, of course, is the conduct of the Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission and its leader, A.Q. Khan, who, in a supposedly rogue operation, provide nuclear weapon material and technology to Libya, to Iran, to North Korea, and I can promise you that's not the full list. That's just the ones that have been publicly identified. Almost certainly there are 2 others, and possibly more. If I knew, I couldn't tell you, but since I have a pretty good idea, I will tell you. Saudi Arabia is certainly one of them. And I would guess the other candidates are Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. but that's more speculative, but I think quite likely. And in that sense, then, certainly that act alone makes it very difficult to accept Pakistan as a member of the nuclear club, especially since this was not a rogue operation. It couldn't have been a rogue operation. It could only have been carried out with the knowledge and support of the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, their equivalent of the CIA, but in some sense a much more powerful institution, which is also backed the Taliban, and of the army. The other problem is that the Pakistan program is fueled by, first, in addition to not having adopted, shall we say, the non-proliferation ethic, and that is being really the only country that has been a proliferator of nuclear technology, at least since the 1950s when the Soviets were assisting the Chinese. There's that problem, and then there's the second problem of relations with India. If there is to be a nuclear war, a war between two nuclear states that involves the use of nuclear weapons, the most likely place is going to be between India and Pakistan. And it will be, India is not obsessed with Pakistan, but the Pakistani army is obsessed with India. And the Pakistani ISI has run its own terrorist programs aimed at undermining, at diverting, at requiring India to expend military resources on dealing with terrorism. It's the one thing that has provoked the Indians. There was an incident in 2001, in December of 2001, in which Pakistani-backed Kashmiri terrorists attacked the Indian parliament. It was a close thing that they didn't get into the parliament, and it was a happenstance that the parliament was not sitting with the prime minister and cabinet there. Had they succeeded in getting into the parliament, and had it been as they expected that the prime minister and cabinet were there, it's really very hard to predict what the consequences would have been. And then there was what the Indians call their September 11th, the attack in 2008 in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now called. But if we're going to get to zero, it is also going to require dealing with the larger issues of the relationship with India and Pakistan, and there are a whole set of other variables that relate to that, including who really runs Pakistan, because the current civilian government, led by the party of, or controlled by the party of the late Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, and headed by her husband Asif Ali Zardari, who's president of the country, actually very much wants to have better relations with India. He has a vision of a common market of Pakistan, for example, Pakistani ports serving as the ports for the overcrowded ports in Western India, high-speed rail links, and so on. And it's because not only is this an economic agenda, but it's a political agenda, because to the extent that you can diminish the tensions between the two countries, it means that the civilian government is better able to get control over the military. So this is not just about India and reducing tensions, it's about establishing civilian control over the military and strengthening democracy in a country which has been ruled for more than half its history by military regimes whose raison d'etre depends on the conflict with India. There's a third issue that is much discussed and a justification for our presence in Afghanistan, which is the notion that extremists emerging from the tribal areas of Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, might get to Islamabad and get control of those nukes. That, I think, is not a serious threat. Just the simple, the Taliban is a purely Pashtun movement in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, and the Punjabis, who are 60% of Pakistan's population, are not going to allow them to take the capital or get control of the nuclear weapons. And so that, in my view, is an overstated threat. Let me just briefly touch on the country that, in some sense, represents the most serious proliferation risk, which is Iran. Now, interestingly, there are two important points about Iran. First, that unlike all the other countries that have, beyond the original five, that have acquired nuclear weapons, Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it says that it does not want to develop nuclear weapons. Now, there are reasons for disbelieving them, but I think this is an extremely important point in any negotiation, because it is always much easier to get party in a negotiation to agree to something that is already their stated position, even if they aren't sincere about it, than it is to get them to reverse a stated position. So our effort to get India and Pakistan to sign up to the NPT was very difficult, and obviously did not succeed. But in the case of Iran, Iran says it wishes to adhere to the NPT. Now, why would the Iranians want nuclear weapons? I could posit three reasons. Security as a deterrent to a U.S. attack. But actually, as a realistic matter, there is no prospect of a U.S. attack on Iran. The Iranians have to observe that the difficulty that the U.S. had in Iraq, a country a third of the size, where 80% of the population welcomed us getting rid of Saddam Hussein, 80% were Sunnis or Shiites or Kurds, to go into Iran 3 times as large, where a large part of the population would rally around the regime if we went in, that is sufficient deterrent. The second point about Iran and nuclear weapons would be or the negative form, is that right now Iran is the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. It is many times more populous than any of the other liberal states of the Gulf. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, then almost certainly other states in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates would be two, would go nuclear, and then Iran's relative advantage would be very much diminished. It would be something of an equalizer. So I come to the third reason, and what I believe is the driving reason for the Iranian program, which is prestige and recognition. And you see this in a proposal that the Iranians put forward to the U.S. in May of 2001. May of 2003, just after the Iraq War, in which they offered to agree to the most intrusive inspections, but what they wanted in return, and to cooperate against al-Qaeda, what they wanted in return was for the U.S. to take them off the axis of evil and to lift sanctions. Well, both of those this axis of evil was both foolish and symbolic, and sanctions were largely not that important. What really lay behind that was an Iranian desire to be recognized for what Iran is, which is the country that has a 2,500-year civilization that is a major power. And so, in my view, one of the ways you deal with the Iranian problem is to try to relate to Iran and to treat it as an important power, to recognize the desire for prestige, to consider it part of the security system. This has been, I think, behind President Obama's approach. It's unfortunate that in 2003, when there was quite a different president in Iran, and somebody who was more interested in opening to the West, that Cheney responded by saying to the Iranian initiative, which came through the Swiss ambassador in Tehran as a non-paper, he said, "We don't negotiate with evil." And now, with a very different regime, Ahmadinejad in office through in circumstances where he's seen as illegitimate, he needs to play to the crowd, it is much harder to get to that situation. But the Iranian program, I'm not worried that Iran with nuclear weapons is going to give it to terrorists. I think that's not the real problem. The real problem with the Iranian program is that it will unravel the non-proliferation regime in the Middle East. certainly in the Gulf, but it's hard to see that the Egyptians, for example, would maintain their non-nuclear status in the face of a declared Iranian nuclear program. And finally, I won't say much about it, but the Israeli program, it's been a fact since the late, Israel's had nuclear weapons since the late 1960s. It has actually not triggered an arms race there. The Israelis, of course, have nuclear weapons to offset the greater conventional strength of their Arab neighbors. In circumstances where they are now at peace with Egypt and Jordan, where there's no realistic prospect of an attack from Syria, and where Israel's nuclear program now creates a greater risk to Israel by, I think, encouraging other states that may wish to acquire nuclear weapons. I think it is, perhaps if there was a different government in Israel, which at some point there will be, a possibility of engaging in negotiations that might go to bring the Israelis to the zero option. But let me just conclude by noting, this is a very brief survey and there are a lot of complexities to it, but again, that this really is the part of the world that poses the biggest problem, the biggest challenge to get into the zero option. And to get there, you're going to have to, it's going to require a lot of attention, a lot of diplomatic maneuvering. It's a very difficult needle to thread. Thank you.
I am so grateful to Peter for taking on India, Pakistan, and the Middle East and Iran, because I want to talk about the P5, and I think I will have more than 10 minutes worth of stuff to say on that. I'd be very grateful if one of you guys would tell me when 10 minutes is up, because I will talk till sunset and stop me. But I want to talk about the process of getting to zero among the P5. You all know the P5, the US, UK, China, France, and Russia. The permanent members of the Security Council. They are the 5 nuclear powers in the NPT. But it's just a coincidence that they are the P5. They were not, when the charter was first drawn up, none of them were nuclear. We weren't even nuclear in 1944 when the charter was being drafted. But these were the 5 great powers that were supposed to be the sort of directorate that would run the world and keep World War III from ever happening. I think that you had this morning outlined to you a very sensible, sound program for how to get the P5 down to zero. But I come back to the question that Mark posed at the very beginning. What is zero? What is real disarmament, nuclear disarmament? And I think there's not a simple answer to that question. I'll offer one definition or description of zero, and I think it's one that Mark and I have talked about, and we're more or less in agreement that it's a meaningful place to get to. But it's not real total zero. I think that through the process that you heard described this morning, we can get to a point where there are no more nuclear weapons deployed. The deployed weapons on here, Russia, in China, in France, and Great Britain have all gone to zero. And the delivery vehicles for the missiles, the bombers, the subs, and so on, these will all have been destroyed or taken apart or neutralized in some way or other. What will not have been done at that stage is a inventory and a program for destroying the weapons in storage or the fissile material in storage. And there are 2 problems with getting from that zero, which I call virtual zero, down to a real, genuine zero, where there isn't any of this stuff left at all. The 2 problems, one is political and one is technical. Let me take the technical one first. It's often referred to as the bomb in the basement. And one of our speakers this morning did refer to it. It means that it's simply a fact that a small number of nuclear weapons can be hidden away in a very small space, and will be completely undetectable. The radiation from them is not detectable at more than a very short distance from where they are. So if they're in a deep enough somewhere in the ground, there is no way on earth that any inspection from a foreign country or an international organization will be able confidently to search them out and say that there is none there. The same is true of fissile material. You have to be careful not to put too much of it in too small a space, or it'll go critical and blow up on you. That's a problem all nuclear weapons states are well able to manage, happily. And this bomb in the basement is a really serious obstacle. And it leads many people to say there is no way we can ever get to zero. Well, I don't believe that. I want to talk about try to put in front of you a scenario that I think will get us eventually to zero. But the bomb in the basement is a real problem, and I don't think there is any technical solution for it. People can hope that improved instrumentation, scientific advances, so on, might make hidden storage sites detectable. I really don't believe it. Certainly not in my lifetime, and probably not in your lifetime, long as I hope those will be. The second problem, the political problem, is the problem of deterrence. In this country in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of hostility toward what was termed MAD, mutual assured destruction. And any sensible person is against mutual assured destruction. That was a lunatic sort of a strategic doctrine that we in the Soviets embraced all through the worst years of the Cold War. On the other hand, mutual assured deterrence is not a lunatic doctrine. It's where we are today. And it is a relatively safe and secure way of avoiding nuclear war. It's not as good as getting rid of it, but it's not all that bad. And every country that has nuclear weapons becomes absolutely infatuated with deterrence. Even before they get a nuclear weapon, the reason they get a nuclear weapon is to deter some threat. And after they've got it, the whole establishment, the military establishment, the political establishment, scientific, all of them are, wow, deterrence is wonderful. Deterrence, even, it is asserted with considerable assurance by a lot of people, and in my view, not without reason. Nuclear deterrence helps to prevent conventional war, because conventional war between a couple of nuclear states would risk running over and escalating into nuclear war, and that would be the ultimate horror of horrors. So deterrence is not a bad thing, but deterrence will prevent us from actually going to zero if we don't somehow find a way to rise above it, to get rid of it, to overcome it. And we are so far from that, you can see in the last 2-3 weeks, in the Obama administration's presentation to the American public and to the Congress of their achievements in the New START agreement with Russia and in the nuclear summit that was just held in Washington, 46, 47 governments to control nuclear fissile material. The administration, which I think doesn't really like nuclear weapons, has gone out of its way to underline how strong our nuclear deterrent is, over and over and over again. Obama, Hillary Clinton, Secretary Gates, the National Security Advisor, all of them have been making speeches about how strong a deterrent we have. And that is really, the American public believes that, accepts it. We are, like the other nuclear countries, we are just marinated in deterrence. And it's going to be very, very difficult to get that out of our system. Now, deterrence is only meaningful, obviously, if there is some kind of a threat that you are deterring. And the solution to the problem of deterrence is not to fight the problem. Don't try to argue that deterrence is a bad thing, but understand that what is needed to get over the obstacle and to really get to a real zero is to see the elimination of the threats, the problems that could arguably call for some kind of a nuclear response. Now, in fact, that process has gone a long way. And I think the speaker this morning implied as much, and in a couple of cases really just about said that. The United States no longer needs nuclear weapons to deter any of the threats that faces us. We are not threatened by a nuclear attack from Russia, or from China, or from Iran, or God knows, India or Israel. We are not threatened by those nuclear weapons. What we are threatened by is leakage from any of some of those systems, or from our own, into the hands of terrorists who cannot be deterred, who don't care if they are willing nuclear suicide bombers. They would be glad to be blown up for the sake of blowing up a bunch of Americans. And so deterrence is absolutely useless for that threat. Our weapons are, in fact, a danger to us. There's a phenomenon that is well known in arms control circles as blowback. This is what happens when you have a gun, and you pull a trigger, and it goes up and blows up in your face. The person who pulls the trigger is killed or badly damaged. Weapons of mass destruction have a blowback effect too. And we experienced that very directly in the year 2001, not in the Twin Towers thing, but in the famous anthrax episode, where anthrax, a biological weapon that we had in our possession, that we had given up the possession of in the BW Treaty, we even renounced the right to use it to retaliate against a biological attack on us. There's no right of retaliation in kind with biological weapons. But we had some, we were researching it, a little, not so small installation right out north of Washington called Fort Detrick. We had researchers working with biological materials, and one of them, a lunatic really, put a bunch of this stuff, all powder like talcum powder, in envelopes and mailed them out to a number of prominent Americans. I don't think there's any understanding today why. It's not even completely, totally certain that he's the guy who did it, but I think it's about 99% certain. The FBI has said that's who did it. And that was blowback. That was just because we had some of this stuff ourselves, and it was more dangerous to us than any possible adversary that we would ever dream of having to use biological weapons against. Well, that, I'm afraid, is true of our nuclear stockpile today. It is more dangerous to us than it is to any imaginable enemy that we may have anywhere on our horizon. So this can only be changed by the kind of total transformation in our outlook that, I forget if it was, I think it was Jack who referred to this, that has begun to take place, where you have a lot of establishment figures now saying exactly what I said, that nuclear weapons are worse for us than not possessing them. And they're putting forward ways of proceeding to go down. Now, I think by the time that they get to the very low level of virtual zero, we also will have had the kind of political evolution that we need in order to overcome this residual affection for deterrence. We aren't there yet, but I think 20 or 30 years, and I hope that the young people in this room will take that very seriously. One of the tasks that they've got to rethink is how to get ourselves out from under this legacy of 50 years of mutual assured deterrence and into a state where really true, genuine, honest zero will be not only the policy, but the stated situation of the United States. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you. Half of you are falling asleep and half of you are freezing cold. So I'm going to try and spice things up a little bit. and I'm batting last here, so a good thing about doing that is that I can try and capture what hasn't been captured. The bad thing about that is that my speech has been already given 5 times. So I'll try and give you a little bit of a different perspective on the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And first, let me just properly introduce myself. I'm Alex Thoma. I'm the program director at the Connect US Fund, and what the Connect US Fund is an NGO funder collaborative based in Washington, D.C., and we focus both through grant making and operations on 4 issue areas in order to increase U.S. global engagement. And they are human rights, climate change and its impact on developing countries, the balance between diplomacy and defense, civil-military balance, and nuclear non-proliferation, which is my background. And I've actually been working very hard this past 1.5 years on a very particular issue, which is nuclear terrorism. That's what brings me here today. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about that specifically, and also the Nuclear Security Summit, which you've heard the other speakers today talk to you about. So what I did over 1.5 years ago was start a coalition of over 40 US NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to work in concert with the Obama administration, both positively and also to shine a light and press them to go further on securing vulnerable materials, or as in the common parlance, loose nukes. I hate that because it's not like they're sitting in your rec room or something. They're actually behind guards, guns, and gates. So what we do as this coalition of over 40 organizations, we've done 2 things. One, we pulled together a consensus set of policy recommendations of how do you actually do this. We talked about securing these loose nukes. How do we actually do that? And we presented it to the Obama administration. It was very well received. And then secondly, just this past Monday, so I'm a little exhausted, this past Monday we put on an NGO parallel summit to the official Obama summit. And I was the lead in putting on this NGO summit. It went really, really well, so I'm very pleased about it. It was a lot of hard work. We worked very closely with Gary Seymour and Laura Holgate in the National Security Council. As they were planning their official summit, we were planning the civilian summit. So the prior speakers laid out really well, I think, the many parts of this comprehensive nuclear security agenda, and so I'm not going to do that again. What I'd like to do is agree with all that they've said, but really just focus on the policies from an insider DC perspective, from where I sit. And what I'd like to do is specifically focus on what the administration has been doing operationally and the nature of this operations. Specifically the bipartisan nature of what's going on in Washington right now, and then what this says about the sustainability of the non-proliferation agenda. And then finally, I'll talk about the road ahead and what you can do as engaged and active citizens. And I never did this in high school, so this is really great. So the first thing that I'll touch on is what's going on within the administration. I think right now we're seeing a world of change, a world of a difference from the past president, President Bush, to the Obama administration. We're not seeing any of the past infighting that we saw in the Bush administration. We're not seeing a Cheney versus Rumsfeld versus Powell infighting. The phrase "no drama Obama" really applies. I mean, the administration is really working very well together across the different agencies, within the different agencies, and that's a breath of fresh air in Washington, D.C. We have, Secretary of Defense Gates, who's left over from the Bush administration, a Republican appointee, and we have Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They've got some kind of mind meld going. So they're actually, the State Department and the Defense Department are all on the same page. Through my experience in my work with the National Security Council, it's the same inside there. They're working really well together, no infighting, which is, like I said, a breath of fresh air. In the wake of this nuke month or nuke week in Washington, I think you'll be seeing this a lot in the press narratives of what the Obama administration is really capable of doing operationally, and we've been doing it very well. So that's the first sort of insider perspective. The second, in terms of the bipartisanship. Obama's operational side apart, this agenda is not a Obama agenda. It's not it doesn't come from the usual suspects. It's not the people who marched on New York City in Central Park, the million person march against nuclear weapons in the 80s. It's not that. This is coming from 2/3 of former secretaries of defense, national security advisors, and as secretaries of state. We talked about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's what I like to call them. The Gang of 4. This is Henry Kissinger. This is George Shultz. These are Reagan and Nixon administration people. This is not the same people who were wearing the peace signs back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it's a real change of who these spokespeople are for this agenda. I think this third time around, Clinton kind of fumbled after the Cold War. What is our agenda? What's going on? Bush thought he knew what he was doing, but we can see where that's left us. And it was very strongly bipartisan, Washington, D.C. And now, so I think the third time around, there's a third time bipartisan charm, as it were. We're also seeing this in terms of the New START agreement, which the previous speakers had mentioned. This New START agreement is endorsed by non-Senate Republicans, including former Bush National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley. Hello.
Hi. Could you slow down the pace a little bit?
I'm from New York, I'm sorry, yes. And I'm young, so I'm excited about it.
I started out there in New York. It was a long time
I'm in
ago.
Vermont, okay. Well, if you missed something in my remarks, I'm happy to address it again in Q&A. So I was talking about how things are working really well in the administration. There's no infighting. And in fact, it's actually a very bipartisan field we're working in right now. So former Bush administration folks are supporting this nuclear non-proliferation agenda. I mentioned Stephen Hadley, former START 1 negotiator under Bush 1, Bush Sr., Ambassador Richard Burt, who is the head of Global Zero. We had the second speaker talk about Global Zero. We have George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, as I mentioned, Gates. He wrote the preface to the Nuclear Posture Review. So, again, to reemphasize, this means that this agenda, I think, is more sustainable. It's across a bipartisan issue. You have not the usual suspects supporting it within Washington, D.C. And I think it's a really strong point against Cold War thinking. So what does this look like in terms of the road ahead? We still have the START treaty needs to get across the finish line. There is opposition. I think one of the questions, what I did was try to look at some of these questions during a lunch. Someone asked about what is the opposition against this agenda. Well, specifically against START treaty, it's the verifiability, it's the bomb in the basement, as well as what will happen if we give up our nuclear weapons, what will our allies do? Are they going to start building their own nuclear weapons because they don't think we're under this nuclear security umbrella anymore? And we can talk about that at the Q&A. So I think START really needs to get pushed across the finish line within Washington, D.C. This is going to happen. We're looking at either this summer or later this year. But START really is a gatekeeper through which everything else needs to happen. So that needs to get done. And I'll talk about what you can do about getting that done in just a minute. Assuming we get START through the Senate and ratified, what's going to be next? The next thing on the agenda is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is actually, it was kind of key. Both Secretary Gates, as I mentioned before, and General Mullen, who heads up the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so heads up the military, both endorsed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. That, again, is a very new thing in this agenda. So what the CTBT does is it bans all the testing of nuclear weapons, and that's important because to the disarmament and non-proliferation agenda, because without testing, countries can't develop more nuclear weapons. It's also, CTBT is also really important to our international allies. So in order for us to keep up our side of the bargain, which is disarming our nuclear weapons, we need to make real progress and show that we really are trying to do this. And so ratifying CTBT is one of those things. So just in closing, the agenda to date has been incredibly productive. This nuclear week, nuclear month in April has been, as you heard, we have the Nuclear Posture Review, the New START Treaty, the Nuclear Security Summit. In May is the NPT Review Conference. But there are some challenges ahead, and I'd like to transition there and just tell you what you can do as concerned citizens and activists to help push us along this road. So a couple of things you've already heard about this morning. One is educate your family and friends about nuclear weapons. Not many people realize the danger that nuclear weapons pose. The greatest security blanket is now the greatest security liability. There are over 23,000 nuclear weapons out there. And there's enough fissile material, nuclear material, to make about 120,000 more. So educate your friends and family. And there's actually a lot of great free stuff out there that you can order. You can put on, dinner parties with videos. I'm happy to point you in the right direction to get those resources. So that's a really easy, low-hanging fruit that you can all do. Second is to contact your senators. Your senators are Bernie Sanders and Patrick Leahy, in case you didn't know. Contact them and let them know that this is important to you as citizens of their state, and ask them to ratify the Strategic Arms Reduction START Treaty that's going to be coming up, as I mentioned, in the next few months here. And also you can ask them to support the President's numbers on non-proliferation programs. The President increased the budget by 25% this year for these programs to lock down these dangerous materials, to get rid of them, etc. So you can call them and say, this really matters to me as a citizen. And it actually, they do take it seriously. I worked on the Hill for several years, and we took every phone call, we reported it back to the members of Congress, and they do listen. So that's the second thing you can do. The third thing you can do, I remember someone on the first panel said, you can write letters to the editor or op-eds in your local paper. You'd be surprised. They're hungry. Journalists are hungry to get this information, and especially hearing from constituents is really important, so you can do that. And then the fourth thing is to join various social movements, civic movements. They're all over Vermont. There's Peace Action. I think there's a Vermont chapter. I know Ben and Jerry is here. They're very socially active. So there are various opportunities you can join a larger movement. And then I'm going to finish here with 5 specific anniversaries or opportunities coming up in the next couple of months that you can organize around. The first is this Tuesday, actually. If you guys have 3 minutes on your cell phones, there's going to be a youth organizing call at 7 p.m. I'm happy to, if you give me your emails, I'll send you the information. From 7 to 8, we're going to have a Obama administration official talk about what they're doing and how you can help. So you're welcome to be on that call. The second is the May NPT Review Conference. There are a lot of people from around the world going down there to show support for the importance of this non-proliferation regime. So it's only a few-hour bus ride from here, so you can do that as well. And it's the whole month of May, so you can do it after finals. If you have finals in May, maybe in June. Anyway, no finals. Okay, great. And Claire's going to organize that. The third thing, there's a new group in Washington, D.C. that's formed by young professionals for the education of young professionals and other engaged leaders. It's called the PROG Project. I think it's just progproject.org. So you can find out more about that on the web. Fourth, go to Capitol Hill. Go after non-finals. After school breaks, go to Capitol Hill, go lobby, visit your senators, visit your members of Congress. They will always find time to see voters. And then the 5th in August, you can do something around the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, August 6th and 9th. So those are other good anniversary and opportunities. And I will stop there so we can have plenty of time for Q&A.
Thank you very much. Our non-finals are Project Week, which will be plenty of time to take on some of these initiatives. If we don't get to your questions this afternoon, don't despair. You can still write them and put them in the jar outside. Alex has so much energy that she has endeavored to answer all of them. And I don't know if that'll be a link through Whitman World Affairs or through the Putney School, but we'll let you know. So do we have questions for our panelists this afternoon? Yes, sir.
Middle East, South Asia, political aspects of conflict. Terrorists have problems driven by conflict with us over various things like political, economic, religion.
That I think, I'm asking, isn't the problem of nuclear disarmament a problem of understanding conflict? Conflict is very pervasive. Internally, within details of negotiation, there's conflict. There's political conflict, as Peter Galbraith just brought out, between different countries. Terrorists have their own conflict with us. So, isn't it a good idea for all of us, especially young people, to learn more about conflict and conflict resolution? How you find common ground between people in conflict, and how ultimately you find the connectedness with the other being. Isn't this a crucial way for young people to look at conflict within a larger context and to practice, by resolving conflicts in classes, in school, out in the baseball field, everywhere, and apply what you learned there to nuclear disarmament and to the roots of nuclear disarmament, like political roots and the like that have been brought up here.
Yeah, yes.
The answer is yes. The panelists agree that it would be good to study conflict in these areas. I have a question from a student this afternoon. Students are looking a little sleepy. Yes, sir, Julian.
If there are loose nukes and nukes in the basement, that seems like a good way to keep those main logic kind of just be the missile defense system. But then just be an arms race if we get the best system. So what's the policy on missile defense?
I actually don't agree with your premise. I think the way to combat loose nukes or vulnerable fissile nuclear materials is to lock them down and eventually eliminate them. Missile defense doesn't work. And so, for various reasons. And also, I think, you know, I didn't talk about it that much, like speeding through my remarks. But nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists is the #1 security threat to the U.S. and our allies. And it's not, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of various folks I work with, experts I work with, it's not a missile defense shield. Sort of a misnomer. I think to me it doesn't work against radical elements like nuclear terrorists. And I think that's what we need to think of now. This new post 9/11 mindset.
So I've had my fair share of dealing with, I guess, civic action, but the problem I see with your whole approach is it's sort of like this reformist aspect where you're like, well, if we put this treaty here, we're going to slowly bring down the amount of nukes gradually over time, and there'll be this utopian point when we'll be nuclear free, like zero, as you say. And I think, first of all, I don't see how reformism is going to work in this case, because you're not challenging the power aspect behind nuclear weapons, because like any sort of institutional equipment, there's power that's used and it's a projection of that. So how would you defend your reformism, I guess?
We're not asking for a statement from Peter.
I'm asking a question. I'm saying, how do you defend this? Because I don't see this as terribly viable, and I still see in the end, there's still enough nuclear weapons to blow up the world many times over, and having this gradual decline is really not fixing anything. I mean, it's ameliorating, but it's really not, I don't see it as a sustainable way of fixing that. So how would you defend your position since you go for what I'm against?
The question is, which I think people were posing to you, what is the alternative? Magic wand? I wish it would work. Doing nothing? It will only make the situation worse. And this is not an unrealistic approach. First, as is pointed out, there are a lot of very hard-headed people who are behind it. And you wouldn't be getting them to be advocating this if, Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and Sam Nunn and Richard Burt, I didn't realize that he had this role. They wouldn't be, and Steve Hadley, Bush's national security advisor, they wouldn't be doing these things if it wasn't realistic. So I think it is realistic. It's also a process. And at each step in the process, you make the world safer. And the real point about, and so if in the end we reduce the nuclear arsenals of the United States, Russia, China to 100 each, well, that's a lot better than the situation as it is now. If we eliminate a lot of the weapons in storage and reprocess the fissile material so that it is no longer easily converted into weapons material, that's good, even if in the end we never get to zero or it takes a very long time. Finally, it's not true that you don't actually eliminate classes of weapons. After the First World War, there was a general agreement that banned first use of chemical weapons in warfare. And that ban was observed through the Second World War, and there are only a couple of countries that broke it: Egypt and Yemen, and Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, and against its own people. But largely it worked. The ban on biological weapons. So the fact that you may or may not get to the perfect end state is not an argument against trying. And these are not unrealistic steps that are being advocated.
I'm kind of curious about the backroom aspects of it, the money. Is there a parallel universe going on next to the political and the approach you're taking of people making a lot of money on selling these weapons, either legally or illegally? And in the process of changing, is there any way that they're going to be able to still make money by, I don't know, investing in learning how to get rid of nuclear waste or anything like that? It's kind of like converting from fossil fuel to alternatives. Is there a way economically for these people that have them are crooks, I imagine, but anyway.
Certainly, if anyone could come up with a good way to dispose of nuclear waste, there would be an enormous rush to try to utilize it and dispose of the stuff. We have utilities, not only in this country, but all over the world, stockpiling the stuff in their backyards in these famous swimming pools, and they're not happy with that. They got into this on the promise from the U.S. government or the French government or whatever government, that the government would find a way to get rid of it in the end, and no government has come up with a solution. So I think anyone who would like a not only profitable, but a glorious career in science, who could come up with effective ways of dealing with this stuff, whose half-life is, what, 30,000 years, that would be a wonderful contribution. And I almost certainly would make that person rich. But I don't think anybody is getting rich off the thing now. There are a lot of people who are making very good livings in managing the nuclear stocks that exist. But it's nothing like Enron or anything of that sort, where people are getting rich illicitly in the process, with the one exception of the one that Peter discussed, A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani, who got very large sums of money and built himself a marvelous big house outside Islamabad for distributing the stuff to the countries that Peter went through in this discussion.
There is a program, the non-Lugar program, which has involved acquiring nuclear materials, and I think it's been expanded for other kinds of materials, in which the U.S. has been purchasing this in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere, paying for the removal. There have also been programs to try and hire scientists, people with nuclear expertise, from the former Soviet Union and I think other places, so that they are not forced to sell their services to either rogue regimes or terrorists. And I think those are important programs. They have been underfunded, and they were cut in the Bush years, and this is part of what I understand to be the 25% programmatic increase of the Obama administration. And so I want to just come to one of your points. When we spoke about getting in touch with your senators, it's good to get in touch with the senators from Vermont, but of course they're already on our side. If we aren't going to get their votes, there's going to be no votes for this. So it's really important for those of you who are from states other than Vermont, not as enlightened as we are, including, say, Massachusetts. The target is frankly 10 Republicans, and that's what you need. And so that's where the focus ought to be. Massachusetts and Maine are two states that where one needs to focus.
Over previous years, the topic of nuclear disarmament has come up and died down. I'm asking the speakers, what makes this entry so different from others? What makes it so promising that a treaty will be signed to get rid of all nuclear weapons?
I think what makes a difference is terrorism. It's after 9/11, and I think that the pairing terrorism with nuclear weapons is the greatest, most catastrophic, but the most preventable threat out there. So I think that's why we have this renewed attention. I mean, we're still seeing the intelligence agencies just a couple months ago were up on the Hill testifying, saying that Al-Qaeda is still seeking to acquire nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons material to use against the U.S. and allies, but they haven't gotten it yet. So there's hope that things need to get done. We mentioned some of them to lock down these materials. I think that, and I think it's just a renewed sense of perhaps community, global community with the internet and the World Wide Web. You can see how truly connected we are. So those two things together would be my best guess.
This shows a generational difference between us. I, of course, would have immediately said, and probably you would have said the same thing, the Cold War is over. That was what made a huge change, and the great reduction in nuclear weapons has followed that. But secondly, I think there's also a realization that these actually are not very useful. There's very little evidence that nuclear weapons have served any political purpose of the states that possess them. They haven't really been used as instruments of coercion. They can't be used in conflict, and they're dangerous. So I think that is also, from a hard-headed strategic point of view, they're just not very helpful.
But I'm wondering, is there some sort of political advantage to having so many of these weapons, right? I mean, once a country has enough to destroy the world over several times, that seems to be sufficient. So I guess my first question is, why do we create so many of these things? But secondly, why is it, if we look at the global zero count, why is it going to take 10 years to get to a certain point, like say, where there are only a few thousand in the world? Couldn't we just say, all right, let's let all the nuclear countries have enough to be able to destroy everyone else, and just get rid of all the extra ones right away? Unless there's some, I guess what I'm asking is, I don't understand the advantage of having so many of these things if they're as destructive as we know they are.
I think the problem getting down to zero really rapidly, the problem lies mainly in Russia. For Russia, it's perfectly true that the weapons are no use to Russia. They don't need them. But the Russians don't know that. They have lost, they feel that they've lost their great power status that they had as the Soviet Union, this great empire. And today they feel that the possession of nuclear weapons is what makes them a world power. It makes them something on the same level with the U.S. and China and India, let's say, and other very large countries. And that sort of, that was talked about earlier this morning about the way that the Russian psyche was damaged at the end of the Cold War by I think it was John Rhinelander who talked about the fact that we more or less promised, or at least they think we promised, that we would not extend NATO into Eastern Europe, and that we would not consider former Soviet states like Ukraine as possible members of NATO. And we've changed that. Whether we really promised is another whole argument. But the Russians really have a strong sense of grievance and a sense that they are being dissed by the United States and the Western countries, and that nuclear weapons gain them the respect that they richly deserve as a great power and a great culture.
I want to respond to that because actually I disagree with that. But first let me go to the issue. Why are there so many? Because in the Cold War, military doctrine and strategic doctrine, including what was taught at the great universities in this country, including by, say, Henry Kissinger, who now is in favor of the zero option, overtook and bore no relationship to common sense. So that one began to calculate, well, if we have so many missiles, the Russians, Soviets have so many missiles, they have multiple entry vehicles, MIRVs. These are warheads which then, when they're in flight, they split off, and there are 10 separate nuclear weapons that come in. How do you count those? There's a whole theology of it. The issue of missile defense. I mean, one of the reasons that missile defense is a bad idea is because it only encourages the people who are launching the missiles to have more missiles or more warheads and that kind of thing. And it's also a bad idea because the real threat is not good. Somebody bringing a nuclear weapon in a suitcase is a bigger threat than coming through the air, and missile defense isn't going to be good against suitcases. But it was this insane doctrine which didn't take the common sense proposition that, hey, if you had 100 missiles and there was a 10% chance that they would get through, that 10 cities would be destroyed, nobody would launch a war under those circumstances. So why did you need any more? On the question of Russia, I agree that after the Cold War ended, we didn't treat them with respect. One should remember in diplomacy that respect is really something very easy to give. There was no advantage to us to gloat that we had won. There was no advantage in treating Russia as a third-rate power, even if it was. What was the point? Why not treat it as a full partner? And to some degree, Bill Clinton did that with Boris Yeltsin. They had repeated summits, and there was still a sense of the superpower relationship. But the Bush administration treated Russia as a third-rate power, and the Russians demonstrated, and particularly in the attack on Georgia, which was significantly provoked by Georgia, that, hey, we're not such a third-rate power, and you need us, not only there, but if you want cooperation on sanctions with Iran. And I think one of the most important successes of the Obama administration has been resetting the relationship with Russia. That said, I don't think Russia is the impediment to the zero option. First, as NATO enlarges, it basically no longer becomes, it is no longer an alliance against Russia, which was its purpose. It becomes something like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's kind of a talk shop, to which Russia will, I imagine, eventually join, as I believe Russia will eventually join the European Union. And for that reason, then, I think Russia becomes a country more or less like France, a certain element of pride, but I think persuadable. I wonder about the Chinese, but I don't know that very much. I think the real impediment to the zero option are the countries that I discussed: India, Pakistan, Israel, and who knows what the developments might be in Iran.
Quickly, just because I want to leave more time, it also just takes a long time to dismantle these things. You can't do it overnight. Going back to your question, it takes a long time to get there. We have 23,000 of these things out there. About 100 of them will change life on Earth as we know it. We have 23,000. So, short answer to your question.
Yeah, you can't just blow them up.
Some of the questioners have stormed the front table. Further questions? Lydia.
How do we convince poor, still developing nations that they should cease all their nuclear weapons development when realistically it would give them much more leverage in terms of the global playing field? We do tend to give countries with nuclear weapons more respect and more prestige. And it's the only thing that gives them any leverage against the United States, especially considering our vast military.
Sorry, were you referring to what region? Asia?
I wasn't thinking about any region.
Oh, okay. So I just would. I think part of the process is to de-link prestige and the possession of nuclear weapons. And I think that is ongoing. There is a global norm against the acquisition of new states acquiring nuclear weapons. So North Korea, when it withdrew from the NPT, did it in a perfectly legal manner, and tested nuclear weapons, but it was deemed to have violated a global norm, and the pressure on Iran is essentially the same issue. And also, in this world, I think that prestige and power is not necessarily linked to weapons that are impossible to use and which are dangerous. It is linked to economic achievement and many other factors. For Iran, if you looked at it from an issue of Iranian security, it makes no sense to get nuclear weapons. Far from deterring the United States, Iranian possession of or acquisition of nuclear weapons, it risks an attack from the United States, or much more likely from Israel. It also, as I said in my presentation, it risks that other countries, which are now militarily much less powerful than Iran, and which are its traditional rivals in the Persian Gulf region, will require nuclear weapons. So from a strategic point of view, it really makes no sense. And lots of other countries have made the same calculation. Japan obviously could go nuclear if it wanted to. South Korea, Taiwan. But they've all concluded that, in fact, this is going to be more damaging to their security and to their place in the world than acquiring it. And that's, I think, a very positive development.
And it's just really expensive. Really expensive to build these things and maintain them. So that's another. It's not. You can't just. It's hard. It's really expensive. And there's I think a growing taboo against. And that's what we need to do as a community. Back to you again. Make them a taboo. They're not these sexy things that everyone wants anymore. They're these things that don't have any purpose. They're dangerous to us. They're dangerous to other people, etc.
How much of countries that are reluctant to agree to nuclear disarmament, how much of that do you think has to do with a fear of needing to use them, and how much is more political and has to do with prestige and sort of pride and that?
I think the answer is it's always a combination of both things. Certainly, in the case of Britain and France, for which there's no military reason at all for either of them to be nuclear powers, it's a kind of confirmation of their great power status. But since their status is now very much linked to this supranational institution, the European Union, I would think that it will not be all that difficult to persuade them to, at the right time, to reduce very significantly. China sees itself, and is seen by some in the U.S. as kind of the new Soviet Union. Not that intense a rivalry, but as the sort of the number one country that number one rival to the United States, and so there's some element of deterrence in the Chinese program. Again, I think that we don't have the kind of Cold War rivalry that we had with the Soviet Union, largely because China doesn't have any place that it's going to expand in the way in which people feared the Soviet Union would expand. The Soviet Union had taken over at the end of the Second World War Eastern Europe. It was actively trying to develop new client states, or at least as we saw it in the Western Hemisphere, obviously Cuba being a case in point, in Africa. But nobody sees any place where China is going to develop client states. There is no constituency for China outside of Chinese influence, aside from economic, outside of China. So it isn't the same kind of rivalry. So again, I think all those are reasons why one can be more optimistic, but the real nub of it comes to these very nasty regional conflicts in South Asia and the Middle East, and trying to get India and Pakistan. Well, get Pakistan, frankly, to be more confident, to be able to get rid of these weapons, that's going to be difficult. Mark asked me, and I think I'll just take your question, whether Pakistan is the sole country that is objecting to the consensus on the cutoff of production of new fissile material. And the question was whether Pakistan would eventually join the consensus or could be persuaded to join the consensus. And my guess is that the answer is yes, at such a point in time that it acquires another additional tranches of fissile material to make weapons. I suppose the estimate is that they have 30 to 60 now, and I mean, I'm just pulling these figures out of the air, but if they had a couple hundred fissile material for a couple hundred, at that point they'd be prepared to agree to cut off. It would be better if they could be persuaded to agree now, but if at the end that's where the cutoff point comes, it's still it's important to draw the line, and that would be a positive development.
If I understand the panel correctly, the risk of the United States and the Soviet Union or Russia having a nuclear war is very small, and really the large risk is terrorism. And I mean, if I understand you correctly, the actual mechanics of building a sophisticated bomb, one that can kill a lot of people, is very expensive. So what we're really talking about is a risk of something like a dirty bomb, which is nowhere near as dangerous as something like biological weapons. So if it's not one, it's the other. In other words, we run a risk of a variety of existential threats, and a lot of them seem to be motivated by inequality. And that really, if we do not start dealing with the essential things in the world that cause people to want to do that kind of thing, whether we deal with nuclear disarmament, I mean, if it's not nuclear weapons, something else will get us. And that don't we run a risk by, I mean, obviously it's laudable to focus on this, but don't we need to look at the underlying problem of why a terrorist group would be going after those?
That was the first question.
I think this comes to a very important point, which is, yes, all these things are interlinked. But if we simply say they're all interlinked, we're going to accomplish nothing, because we can't solve everything all at once. And that's why the only way you can approach these problems is to break them down and to focus on measures that that keep nuclear material safe, that would prevent nukes from going into the hands of terrorists, which I have to say I think is also a very small risk. More significant, the risk of regional nuclear conflict, India, Pakistan, what might happen with Iran, Israel attacking Iran. I think that's a more significant problem, maybe the most significant. General reduction of weapons in U.S. and Russian arsenals. But all these other things, including why terrorists want to attack the United States, yes, they're important international policy issues. They are, to some degree, related. Obviously, Israel's nuclear program, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is part of it. But they have to be solved as separate, discrete measures.
We were talking about the question that I'm going to pose. The United States, first off, there have been several books written about the concept of first strike. Michio Kaku wrote a book about 15 years ago about first strike. Robert Aldrich, who designed these first strike weapons, wrote a book on first strike. There have been others. What a first strike is the United States capability to, because of the accuracy of the delivery systems of these nuclear weapons, the capability to completely knock out the retaliatory capability of an adversary. I spent 3 years of my life in federal prison for attempting to nonviolently disarm one of these horrible weapons. There are 500 Minuteman III nuclear missiles out in the West. There are 19 Trident submarines. One Trident submarine has the capability of knocking out 409 different cities. I guess what I want to say is that the United States alone has this capability. It's not just deterrence, it's fear. No other nation has the ability to do what we can do with these nuclear weapons because they're so accurate. And they can cross target and deliberately assure that the retaliatory capacity cannot be met. My question is, how are we going to convince third world countries or any country that's a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty that we are serious about getting rid of weapons, nuclear weapons, when we are not going to do anything about these first-strike weapons, which have been deemed as illegal under international law by the 1996 World Court opinion? How are we going to do this? You don't read about first strike in the mainstream press, but it's there.
If I understood right, the question was premised on the idea that we have a capability to launch a disarming first strike against Russia or any other country, one that would completely wipe out their ability to retaliate against it. And that simply is not the case and has never been the case. And there has never been a Pentagon document or briefer who has asserted that we had a capability for a disarming first strike that would leave the United States intact and immune to any response.
He has testified at our court trials because he works on these weapon systems. He has taken the stand, but the judges have consistently refused to allow the jury to hear his testimony because the judges do not want to put this country on trial for the crimes, the international crimes that it is committing by possessing these weapons.
That's right. I don't know this case at all, but I have been briefed on what's called the Single Integrated Operations Plan, the SIOP, which is the plan that the Pentagon has and has had for 45 whatever years now to deal with the problem of to carry out a preemptive strike, a first strike against the Soviet Union, now Russia, if the president ordered it to do so. And every president has been briefed on this Single Integrated Operations Plan, and they have been told, if you give the order, we'll carry it out, but we will be retaliated against. The United States will be destroyed in the response that the Russians will launch against us. And I believe that was the case 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and remains the case today. The disarming first strike is simply a myth.
Two things. First, I think what is almost certainly illegal under international law is the use of nuclear weapons in circumstances where there would be significant civilian casualties, which, unless they were used against a naval flotilla, would almost always be the case. Second, another problem that goes with any first strike action, and that has also been a huge problem in our conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Yes, we have very precise weapons. We can deliver them with high degree of certainty to where we want to deliver them. But we're not very good at knowing what's there. The intelligence, for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that much of it's not knowable, is often shortcoming, is often very, very weak. And so even in a case like we were to strike a country like Iran, would we get it all? Would we be right? Certainly, based on my experience in government, I would be skeptical about that.
At this point, Jack Mendelson, if you'd be so kind, will come up and summarize the afternoon's discussion.
It's very difficult, as Jim said earlier, it's difficult to summarize in a way that is helpful, but I'll try, I think. Well, points that came out, an important one, is that there are problem spots in the world that need to be dealt with, where issues have to be resolved, that they do contribute to the sense among some nations that they need to have nuclear weapons to protect themselves because of neighborhood issues. And there are long chains of events. Just to extend one of them, Peter Galbraith spoke about the Indian-Pakistani conflict, but you could actually argue that chain that drove the Pakistanis to need or to feel they needed nuclear weapons actually starts with the United States. The United States developed nuclear weapons in 1945. Russia felt it had to have nuclear weapons, so it developed nuclear weapons. Then there was a falling out between Russia, or the Soviet Union, and China. China felt it had to have nuclear weapons. Actually, part of the falling out was over the development of Chinese nuclear weapons. The Chinese have nuclear weapons, go to war with India. India feels it has to have nuclear weapons. India gets nuclear weapons. And then Pakistan feels it has to have it. So the chain is a very long one, and you can probably trace these changes, chains in other parts of the world. In any case, it's quite clear that the getting to zero isn't just a decision that can be made by the United States and Russia. It involves solving other problems in the world or solving conflict areas in the world so that other nations can feel comfortable in that zero environment. And also, Jim mentioned something important, and I think it was generally the theme here, is that we need to think differently about why we have weapons. That we had weapons in an environment where we felt that they were required to deter their use. What's happened now is that deterrence, in some cases, no longer is applicable. You can deter an entity which has something to lose in the bargain, in the exchange. In other words, a nation or a leadership of a nation might recognize that if they were to go to war or to use these weapons, that they would risk their own country, their own lives, their own power. But when what you're concerned about are entities that don't have anything that they can lose, they have nothing in the pot, if you will, in this game, deterrence as sort of conventionally viewed doesn't work. It just doesn't have the same impact. And we have to change our understanding of why nuclear weapons were there, or are there, to take this into account and to therefore think differently about why we have or why we shouldn't have nuclear weapons. And I think the third theme, and a very important one, which came up, all of these came up in another session, but which have been asked several times, is, well, what do we do now? And I think Alex gave us a good list of things to think about. Be active individually, call, talk, argue, interact. Let me see, I know I have them here everywhere, but what do I do? We need civic involvement. There is a big event there are public events of all the time, but there's a big event coming up next month. Stay in touch with your elected representatives at every level and make sure that they sense there is sentiment in the population for this, that, or the other thing in this case. So obviously we're talking about the need to address the question of why do we have so many of these weapons, and when and how are we going to start to bring them down. And every year there is this event of the commemoration of the first use of nuclear weapons in anger and in wartime. But there are a lot of, we also spoke about writing to your newspapers or whatever media that you have access to. There are lots of things that can be done. But the important thing, or sort of the overriding thing is to keep yourselves involved, keep yourselves informed, and keep active, and don't despair. We're going to win this. Thank you.
Responsible for the conference today.
We've all been sitting kind of a long time, but there's something really important that we have to do before we go, and that is to give thanks to various people who worked so very hard on this conference. And obviously, I'm going to thank the speakers, each one of them sitting up here, and they're sitting right down in front of me, on behalf of the Wyndham World Affairs Council and the Putney School and the community at large. We're just hugely grateful to each one of you for being with us today and for sharing the knowledge you have gained from so many years of experience working towards nuclear disarmament. Thank you all so much. Among the speakers was our friend and neighbor, Mark Schlepper. Mark taught at the Putney School when he first returned from service in the Second World War. Later in life, he became president of the Lawyers Alliance for Rural Security in Washington. And much later, when he moved back to Putney, he became a board member of the Wyndham World Affairs Council. This conference was really his idea. And with contacts and resources in every group, he has spearheaded our planning efforts with enormous determination. So we're extremely grateful to him too. I would also like to thank the board and the members of the Wyndham World Affairs Council. They've been extremely generous contributors of both financial and in-kind support. Lastly, and speaking now as chair of the Wyndham World Affairs Council, I especially want to thank the Putney School community. You've stepped up to the plate in the last months with a lot of energy and vigor, and it's been a great pleasure for us to collaborate with you. Now, Pete says that he has a few more words, but before he does, I'm going to point out to you that it is 3 o'clock. The experts are not going to leave this building until shortly before 4. So that means that you have several options left to you in the next almost an hour. And these are the options. If you have questions that you've not been able to ask, you can drop them in that same glass container where you dropped your other questions. And Alex has agreed to try to answer as many of those as she can. And someone, probably me or someone from our organization, will type those and email them to her, and we'll send them back to you. So please feel free to put questions in there if you would like to do it. Secondly, I want to call your attention to the DVD called Nuclear Tipping Point that's been running throughout the day. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but in essence, it would be a summary of everything that's been talked about here today, and it does end with several stops that citizens can take. So if you have time and would care to walk over to the field house, you can take a look at that. As we've been saying, this is the big four. It is Henry Kissinger, it's George Shultz, it's William Perry, and Sam Nunn, who have been working tirelessly in the direction of nuclear disarmament, and they have put together, and by the way, we have several copies of this DVD, which we will make available to church groups or any other groups that are interested in showing it for discussion purposes. And lastly, I want to call your attention to the tour of the field house. The field house is really almost a unique building in terms of energy efficiency, and this is your chance to see it and have some people explain to you how it happens that they are so energy efficient that they can earn money off their building, which I think is a miracle. So thank you all for coming, and here's Pete for the last words.
So within the past year, we lost a farmer and a citizen from Dummerston, Vermont, named Dwight Miller. And Dwight's credo was that the world is run by those who show up. And for the 16-year-old sitting in the audience today facing overwhelming annihilation, they wonder, what can I do? I'd like to thank our panelists for embodying that credo by showing up and telling us that this is the example of reaching out to your community and working hard, and you too can make a difference. Thank you.